In this video, we're going to start Chapter 9, which is all about language and thinking. And so we're going to start with the basic question, what is language? So to start with the definition, language is talking about a system of rules and symbols. Combining these symbols generates infinite possible meanings and messages. So we are putting together letters into words, words into sentences, and so on and so forth. So it's allowing us to convey information and get across things that have meaning to others. And when we talk about psycholinguistics, it's going to be people who actually study the psychological aspects of language. So people who want to understand how we can produce, understand, and learn how to speak or read or sign different languages. So what makes a language a language? This is an interesting question, especially as someone like myself who actually studies communication in non-human species. So I look at communication in black-capped chickadees and what makes their mode of communication different and distinct from what we classify as a language. So let's talk about some properties of language. So the first thing is that language is both symbolic and structured. These symbols can be things like sounds or signs or gestures, something that is symbolic in nature, that's making it possible for us to represent objects or events or ideas or feelings or actions. And these symbols allow us to form and transfer different mental representations. Basically, saying that we can have a thought, we can have an idea in our heads, and we can put that into words and share that thought or idea with someone else. So if you want to tell a friend about a restaurant that you went to that you really liked, you can verbalize that exact idea. You can tell the friend about the restaurant and that you liked it and maybe that they should go too. So you are forming your own mental representation of that concept, and then you're transferring that, you're sharing that with someone you're speaking with. And so these symbols themselves are actually arbitrary because words and letters and signs and gestures don't necessarily look like the thing that they stand for. So for example, the word bird doesn't actually look anything like a bird. Nothing about the shape of the letters invokes that feeling of a bird, but we understand that as arbitrary as those symbols are, as arbitrary as that word may be, when we see it, we understand that it's representing that concept of a bird. And we can talk about the grammar of a language. And here, grammar is specifically the set of rules that are going to dictate and determine how we can combine symbols in order to create something meaningful, something that we can communicate with others. So you can have rules about which letters come after each other. So in English, we have the rule of I before E, with the exception of when they come after C. But you can also have rules about what order words go in. So what order do the words go in a sentence? You would probably say I go somewhere before you would say go I somewhere. And those orders are sort of embedded rules or embedded grammar that help us speak or sign or write a language correctly. Our next property of a language is that language conveys meaning. Another term is the semantics. And so when we talk about semantics, we're talking about the specific meaning of words and sentences. What is the meaning of this thing that we're talking about? So we can talk again about forming and sharing those mental representations. And it's important because those mental representations, those concepts that we're trying to get across, have some sort of meaning. So we're sharing information. And language is especially tricky because semantics is more than just the surface meaning of what's going on. So you're looking at the words themselves there could be more to it than that. So if you ask a friend, how did you do on a test, and they respond to you that they nailed it, you understand that they nailed it in that they did really well on the test. They felt that they performed very well. They don't actually mean that they literally took a hammer and nail to the test. So the semantics there, the meaning of those words, is more than just the words themselves. There's also some context, some experience, all sorts of things. And we'll get more into that as this chapter goes on. And the last two properties of language that we want to talk about are the fact that language is both generative and it permits displacement. So what I mean by that is when we talk about generativity, we're talking about the fact that you can combine the symbols in a language to generate an effectively infinite number of messages, and each of those messages that you're generating can have a novel meaning. So you can put together words that have never been put together before. You can have a unique thought, or you can get across unique information. Your sentences can be almost nonsense. If you think of, say, Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland, a lot of that was language that maybe followed the semantics and grammar of the English language, but there wasn't so much meaning to it. It was almost nonsense. But that was showing off the generativity of language, where you could generate and develop new things that no one would have ever thought to put together before. And another cool one is displacement. So it allows you to communicate about things, events, and objects that aren't physically present. So sometimes if you think of a language, you could think of, oh, well, I can point to the things on my desk. I have a water bottle. It's right here. I can point to it. So that's talking about something that is physically present in this space at this time. But I can also talk about something that is elsewhere. I could talk about something that's on campus. So it's not here, it is elsewhere. It's displaced in location. Or we can talk about things that happened in the past, things that are displaced in time. And we can even take it further than that, and it doesn't have to just be things that have been present at some time. We can talk about imaginary things, things that have never happened before, or things that may happen in the future. And so we can talk about these concepts that may or may not exist, that may or may not have happened, and we're displacing them in both time and location. And we can use this language, this conveying of words, and we can symbolically represent these events or things or concepts at different points and places in time and space, which is really cool, because it would be very difficult if language restricted us to talking about just what's here and now. But now that we've talked very briefly about some of the properties of language, let's get into the structure of language. And we've kind of hinted a little bit about the idea of language having a difference between the words that you see, the words and the idea of I nailed that test, meaning something different than what the words themselves mean. And there's actually terms for that, where the surface structure is going to be what you see on the surface, the ways that those symbols are combined. And our surface structure relies very heavily on syntax, which is our rules for combining things. It's basically the grammar of how we stick things together. And then on the other hand, we could have the deep structure of a sentence. And the deep structure is the underlying meaning of those combined symbols. And our deep structure is more about the semantics, the idea of rules for connecting these symbols together. So if we think of the surface structure, what words do we have? And the deep structure is going to be looking at those words and taking everything into account. What do those words actually mean? And so we can start thinking about some unique cases where we can have sentences that have different surface structure, so they can have different words or combinations, but they have the same deep structure. They have the same meaning. So we can say that Mary went to the zoo, or that Mary visited the zoo, but both of those are talking about the same event, even though they're worded differently, even though they have a different surface structure. That deep structure, the meaning of those words, is the same. And on the other hand, you can have a single sentence that actually has two deep structures. So only one surface structure, only one arrangement of words, but you can interpret it two different ways. You can have two different meanings. Maybe it's an ambiguous meaning. And the example the textbook gives us is the sentence, "The police must stop drinking after midnight." And you can break that up two different ways. So maybe the police have to stop people who are drinking after midnight. Or you could interpret it as the fact that the police themselves should stop drinking. They should no longer be drinking after midnight. So you have two different meanings, two different deep structures to that single sentence, to that single surface structure. And in practice, when we're listening to someone speak, or if we're reading something on our screens, or any form of communication like that, we move from our surface structure, we move from the specific words that someone's using, and we have to kind of transition from the words that they're using over to the deep structure of the meaning of what they're saying. So we're moving from what is said, that surface structure, to what they mean, the deep structure. And interestingly, we tend to remember that deep structure a lot better than we do the surface structure. So we tend to remember the basic idea, the meaning behind the words, a lot better than we remember the exact wording that was used to get the point across. Now we've kind of gotten a little bit ahead of ourselves here. We've been talking about meaning and words that make up sentences, but if we're going to talk about the structure of language, we should actually talk about all of the structures of language. We should break things down into their most basic units and then work our way back up to sentences and words. So we're going to start talking about what's called the hierarchical structure of language. And when we talk about a hierarchy, we're basically saying that there's a system of some kind where the things in that system are ranked according to some kind of criteria. So if we're going to talk about this hierarchy within the structure of language, we can talk about sort of the smallest units and build our way up to the largest units. So let's start with those smallest units. We're going to start with what are called phonemes. And phonemes are the smallest units of sound that can be recognized as separate, as distinct from each other. And these aren't quite the same as, say, the letters of the alphabet. There's more than there are letters in the alphabet. These are going to be sounds. So some of them are going to be similar to letters in the alphabet, but we also have things like combinations of letters. So, for example, the TH sound, that is a phoneme. We also have SH or PH. Those tend to go together. So those are distinct sounds and count as unique phonemes. So they don't correspond to letters of the alphabet, but we can sometimes talk about them similarly. And humans, as a species, can produce hundreds of different phonemes. To put it into perspective, the English language uses 44 phonemes. Other languages will have different numbers of phonemes, though no language uses all 100 plus of them that have been identified. The range tends to be from as few as 15 to as many as 80, which is quite a wide variety. And we can move on to our next the next building block, the next step up. So slightly larger conceptually than our phonemes, we can start talking about morphemes. And morphemes are going to be the smallest units of meaning. And morphemes are made up of combinations of those phonemes. So our phonemes were just collections of sounds that are distinct from one another. And morphemes are when we start combining those sounds together. And we can talk about how syntax determines how we're going to combine these phonemes into morphemes. So what are the rules for putting together those sounds into these small units of meaning? So you can kind of think of these as words-ish. And the reason why I say ish is because some morphemes aren't themselves words on their own. So you can have single letters like S and ED. So the S, which would make a word plural, is a morpheme on its own. And ED, to say make something past tense, is a morpheme on its own. Other morphemes could be single-syllable words, things like hat or bat, hat. They don't all have to rhyme, but single-syllable words can also be morphemes. But not all morphemes are words. There's a distinction there. And if we talk about, we'll stick with English as our standard for talking about quantities here. So we had said that English has about 44 phonemes, and when we combine those, we can get more than 100,000 morphemes. So it goes much, much larger as we go from one step to the next. Now, we took some time to talk about our phonemes and morphemes individually because if you don't have a special interest in language, you may never have heard those terms before. But as we keep moving up our hierarchy, as we keep getting to larger and larger conceptual ideas here, we start coming into stuff that you should be familiar with. So the next step up on our hierarchy, after our morphemes, we get to words. And you should have a concept of what words are because we use them all the time. It's important here to note again that some words are also morphemes. So talking about those single syllables, cat, hat, bat, things like the or with could all be words and morphemes. And if we do our numbers again, we go from 100,000 morphemes in the English language, and those can combine to make over 500,000 words in the English language. So we're getting larger and larger as we go up again. And then from words, we can combine words into phrases. And phrases are just a small collection of words, smaller than a sentence, but that form a conceptual unit. So they come together and get across some kind of concept. So we could talk about the water bottle that I was mentioning earlier. That phrase, the water bottle, would be a phrase. And then if we want to go the next step up, we can combine phrases into sentences. And sentences are our final step that we talk about in the hierarchy, but you could kind of expand this conceptually. You could think, well, then you combine sentences into paragraphs and paragraphs into whole arguments or whatever. So we can get larger and larger. But our hierarchy is going to stop at sentences. And as per usual, for people who like having a visual to figure out the concept we're talking about, we can look at this diagram here, where we can start at the very bottom with our smallest units, our phonemes, which are those distinct sounds that can be told apart from each other. And if you notice, across the bottom here, we have some single letters, so we have a Z and a T and an F, but we also have some weird looking symbols, so this upside down E and this D with a plus on it. And those are actually symbols that are used by linguists as sort of a stand-in for particular sounds. So if you're talking about how something is pronounced, these symbols help linguists and people who study language to figure out what sound it is you're talking about. So we can combine these individual sounds. So this one here would probably be the TH sound, which basically sounds like the. We move up to our morphemes. You combine those single phonemes, put multiples of them together, and get your morphemes. So we can have single words, things like the, to, but we also break down sort of larger words. So here, players is broken down into play, and the morpheme and the morpheme s. So not all morphemes are full syllables, not all morphemes are words. They can be these fragments, these morphemes. And then you can combine those into words, combine the words into phrases, and combine the phrases into sentences. So moving up that hierarchy, and you arrive at the top where you're having a discourse, that discussion, the transmitting of information by communication. And so that's our hierarchy to get us to understand this structure of language.